Starting on August 29, 2005, the biggest catastrophe to ever befall an American city in peacetime took place in New Orleans. Over 800,000 people were driven from their homes, at least 1,482 were killed, and 80% of the city's buildings and infrastructure lay underwater for weeks. Estimates of the total economic damage to the city is at least $100 billion. In spite of the enormity of the disaster and the extensive media coverage it received, few people understand what really happened in New Orleans or what caused it. Fewer still realize that they too may be living under a similar or even greater threat. In this video, we expose the key myths and misunderstandings about the New Orleans flood and the role the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers played in the city's near destruction.
6 months ago today, the storm hit. Mississippi was slammed. Louisiana's levees broke. The biggest natural disaster in American history.
A natural disaster over which we have, no control. It's an act of God. It happened.
The fact that a major American city went through a natural disaster.
Natural disaster.
Katrina.
Natural disaster.
Natural disasters.
The number one myth about what happened in New Orleans is that it was a natural disaster. This is false. Though the storm did do some wind damage to the city, this damage could have been repaired within a few months, if not weeks. What catastrophically damaged 80% of the city was flooding, and the flooding was caused by a major systematic failure of the federally engineered U.S. Army Corps of Engineers levee system. The levees and flood walls, designed and built at the cost of millions of U.S. taxpayer dollars, failed in 53 different places. In two neighborhoods, Lakeview and the lower Ninth Ward, levee walls totally collapsed, sending walls of water crashing into homes and businesses at velocities capable of moving structures off of their foundations and tossing cars like toys. Other neighborhoods sat in salty or brackish contaminated floodwater for a month or more, because dozens of pumps were rendered useless due to canal wall failures along the discharge channels. Ray Seed, a professor of civil engineering at the University of California at Berkeley, who participated in an in-depth study of the New Orleans flooding, called it the most expensive engineering failure in American history, and quite possibly the second most expensive in human history, second only to Chernobyl. The catastrophic flooding of New Orleans was an engineering disaster, not a natural one.
Here's what you need to know. President Bush can propose to pledge another $billion or $100 gazillion into rebuilding New Orleans. It doesn't matter. You can't change New Orleans' doomed geography.
During the levee failure catastrophe, while thousands remained stranded in the city without food, water, or medical care, some claimed that the source of New Orleans' troubles was that it was located in the wrong place. This is false. Situated at the end of the Mississippi River, New Orleans is the literal gateway to America's agricultural and industrial heartland. Upstream of New Orleans, the Mississippi River becomes too shallow to allow ocean-going freighters and container ships. Therefore, New Orleans and the land it sits on has historically been, is now, and in all likelihood will probably always be, one of the most important ports and transshipment points in the United States. New Orleans used to be much better protected against the impact of hurricanes and other storms. When it was founded, the city was located 125 miles from the Gulf of Mexico, and sheltered by hundreds of square miles of wetland, which acted as a buffer against storms and storm surges. The reckless dredging of over 10,000 miles of canals by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, as well as oil and shipping interests, has fractured and undermined this protective barrier. To date, almost none of this damage has been repaired, and what is left of the natural marsh continues to erode.
The article outlines how New Orleans sits way below sea level in a great big bowl.
The lower Ninth Ward, which was devastated by the flood, is actually above sea level, as are the city's originally settled areas, including the French Quarter, the Central Business District, the Garden District, Treme, the Marigny, Bywater, and Uptown. While it is true that parts of New Orleans are below sea level, New Orleans is not the only coastal city that faces flooding challenges. In New York City, much of the city's transportation system, its subways and tunnels, lie below sea level and require 24-hour-a-day pumping to remain dry. London, the biggest city in Europe and one of the most important financial centers in the world, depends on a massive flood barrier to stay above water during storms. And then there's Holland. For over 400 years, one of the most prosperous and technologically advanced nations on earth. 24% of the country, including many of its most populated cities and towns, lie below sea level. The country survives thanks to a well-conceived, well-built, and well-maintained levee system. An area does not have to be under sea level to flood when levees fail. This is not New Orleans, it's Fernley, Nevada. Located 4,200 feet above sea level, it flooded when a local levee collapsed. Improperly built levees caused the destruction in New Orleans, not the fact that a portion of the city is built below sea level.
I have never, ever seen anything as badly bungled and poorly handled as this situation in New Orleans. Where the hell is the water for these people? Why can't sandwiches be dropped to those people that are in that Superdome down there? I mean, what is going on? This is Thursday. This is Thursday. This storm happened 5 days ago.
Tens of thousands of buildings still awaiting demolition. Less than half the schools reopen. Crime has soared, and of the $116 billion in federal aid promised to the Gulf region, less than $7 billion has actually been spent rebuilding New Orleans.
There are taxpayer-funded U.S. Army Corps of Engineers projects in all 50 states. 43% of all Americans live in a county with an area protected by a levee. In 28 states, some levees have been declared by the Corps itself as being in a state of active failure. Here is a short list of American cities that are affected: Detroit, Louisville, Nashville, Pittsburgh, Memphis, Baltimore, Kansas City, Omaha, Portland, Seattle, Honolulu, Jacksonville, Savannah, Albuquerque, Los Angeles, Sacramento, and even Washington, D.C. Many of these places have levees that are in worse condition than the New Orleans levee system was before it failed.
Somebody has just dumped rock here. You have to put in engineered rock in order to make this a strong levee.
You've got junk holding the levee up here. 100 yards that way, millions of dollars worth of homes.
Funny how that works.
Surprisingly, the place most at risk to levee failure is Sacramento and the Sacramento River Delta.
If this levee below us broke, these houses would be under 20 feet of water?
Approximately, yeah. Here in Sacramento, two of California's great rivers come together, the Sacramento and the American. And that means trouble right here in River City, with a huge new population growing behind aging, crumbling levees.
Levee failures here would not only devastate cities like Sacramento and Stockton, it would also result in seawater contamination of the only source of fresh water for over 23 million Californians, and render the supply unusable for years.
If a hurricane such as Katrina ever visited New Orleans again, I'm convinced that the work that the Corps will be doing, as I've described, will prevent any catastrophic flooding. There will be some flooding, but no catastrophic flooding that has occurred.
The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has no plans to change its business-as-usual approach to levee building and maintenance. With a few rare exceptions, no political figures appear interested in examining, let alone addressing, the situation at all. Currently, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is without meaningful oversight, and it's just a matter of time before the catastrophe that struck New Orleans is repeated in other parts of the country. If this situation is going to change, it's going to be up to the individual citizens to put pressure on Congress, the White House, your governor's office, local officials, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to face the problem squarely and solve it. To learn what you can do to help turn this situation around and make sure New Orleans and other parts of the U.S. don't suffer the same fate New Orleans did in 2005, visit levees.org. Levees.org is a grassroots, nonpartisan group that works to educate citizens about ongoing levee failure risks to New Orleans, southern Louisiana, and the rest of the nation. With your help, we can save lives and communities.